Briar Ridge Mental Hospital wasn't just a building. It was a shadow hanging over the entire town of Colton. It sat at the edge of town, a squat, gray structure surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence. Overgrown weeds clawed at the foundation, and its windows, barred and clouded with grime, seemed to watch the town like unblinking eyes. For as long as I could remember, the hospital had been the source of every ghost story, every whispered warning to kids daring each other to get too close. On quiet nights, when the wind carried just right, you could hear the screams, high-pitched wails, guttural moans, and, worst of all, the laughter, manic and shrill, like it was coming from something inhuman. People in Colton learned to live with it, or at least pretend they could. "I don't know how you sleep at night," Mrs. Calloway, my neighbor, once said, shaking her head as she poured me a cup of coffee. "You get used to it," I lied. The truth was, I hadn't slept well in years. Most nights, I'd lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint echoes of madness drifting through the night. The hospital wasn't just a place for the mentally ill. It was where they sent the ones no other place could handle. The violent, the unpredictable, the ones who made even the guards nervous. Rumors swirled about what went on inside. Electroshock therapy, experimental drugs, patients locked in solitary for weeks. No one really knew the truth. But everyone in Colton agreed on one thing. You didn't mess with Briar Ridge. That's why, on the night the sirens went off, the entire town froze. It started around 11 p.m. I was sitting on my porch, sipping a beer and trying to ignore the distant sounds of laughter echoing from the hospital, when I saw the red and blue lights flashing in the distance. A moment later, the piercing wail of the alarm cut through the night, loud and shrill enough to make my beer bottle slip from my hand and shatter on the porch. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Porch lights flickered on up and down the street, and I saw shadows of my neighbors stepping onto their porches, craning their necks toward the hill where the hospital sat. Then came the sound that sent a chill down my spine. A voice crackled over the hospital's loudspeakers, distorted and panicked. "Attention! This is an emergency. 2 patients have escaped. Secure your homes. Stay indoors." I stared at the loudspeakers, my brain struggling to process what I just heard. 2 patients. Escaped. A knot of fear twisted in my stomach. "What do we do?" my neighbor Paul called from across the street. I didn't have an answer. The hospital wasn't far from town, just a 15-minute walk. If those patients were coming this way, my thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, blood-curdling scream from the direction of the hospital. It wasn't the usual kind of scream we were used to hearing. This one was closer, much closer. Then the power went out. One by one, the streetlights flickered off, plunging the entire neighborhood into darkness. "Get inside!" someone shouted, their voice high with panic. I didn't need to be told twice. I slammed my front door shut, locking it and pulling the curtains tight. Outside, I could hear the muffled sound of neighbors doing the same. Doors slamming, locks clicking, whispers of fear spreading through the night. But then, just as the panic seemed to settle into an uneasy silence, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic knock on my front door. Not loud, not frantic, just a calm, deliberate knock. I froze, my hands still clutching the curtain. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. The knock came again, slower this time. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept toward the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the peephole. I pressed my eye to the glass, and what I saw made my blood run cold. A man was standing on my porch, his face pale and thin, his eyes wide and unblinking. He was wearing a hospital gown, the kind they give patients at Briar Ridge, and his hands were pressed flat against the glass of the storm door. He was smiling. Not a friendly smile, a wide, unsettling grin that showed too many teeth. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice soft and childlike. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. "No," I whispered, barely able to get the word out. The man tilted his head, his smile never faltering. "Why not?" he asked. Before I could answer, he started laughing. A high, shrill sound that sent shivers down my spine. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my phone. The line was dead. And then I remembered, the power was out. I grabbed a kitchen knife, my fingers gripping the handle so tightly they ached. When I turned back to the door, the man was gone. My heart raced as I scanned the darkened windows, half expecting his face to appear in one of them. The house was silent, save for the faint sound of my own breathing. But outside, in the distance, I thought I heard something else. Laughter. Not one voice this time, but two. And it was getting closer. Somewhere out there, 2 escaped patients from Briar Ridge were roaming the streets. And now they knew where I lived. For a long time I just stood there, clutching the knife and staring at the door, half expecting the man to return. But he didn't. The laughter I'd heard outside faded into the distance, replaced by an eerie silence that felt even worse. I forced myself to move, checking every lock and window in the house, my hands shaking as I double-checked each one. When I was sure everything was secure, I crouched by the living room window, peeking through a crack in the curtains. The street was pitch black, the power outage plunging the entire neighborhood into darkness. Then I saw it. A faint flicker of movement near Paul's house across the street. 2 figures, one tall and lean, the other shorter and stockier, were standing on his front lawn. They were both wearing hospital gowns, their pale legs and bare feet visible in the faint moonlight. The taller one, the same man who'd been on my porch, was holding something in his hand. I squinted, trying to make it out. It was a rock. Before I could react, he hurled it at Paul's window with a loud crash, shattering the glass. Paul's silhouette appeared in the broken window, his voice sharp and angry. "Who's out there?" The shorter man let out a high-pitched giggle, stepping closer to the broken window. "Paul, don't open the door," I whispered to myself, my heart pounding. But it was too late. The front door creaked open, and Paul stepped outside, holding a baseball bat. "Get off my property," he yelled, raising the bat defensively. The taller man smiled, his teeth glinting in the faint light. "We're just looking for a friend," he said, his voice calm and even. Paul hesitated, his grip on the bat faltering. "What friend?" he asked warily. The taller man tilted his head, his smile widening. "You," he said simply. Before Paul could react, the shorter man lunged at him, knocking the bat out of his hands. Paul let out a shout, struggling against him, but the taller man joined in, pinning Paul to the ground. I watched in horror as they dragged him toward the side of the house, their laughter echoing in the night. For a moment, everything went quiet. Then I heard Paul scream. It wasn't the kind of scream you hear in movies or nightmares. It was raw, primal, and filled with a terror I'd never heard before. I stumbled back from the window, my chest heaving as I tried to steady my breathing. I wanted to help, but what could I do? I was one person with a knife, and they were 2 psychos strong enough to overpower Paul. The screaming stopped suddenly, leaving an eerie silence in its place. I crept back to the window, my heart pounding. The front yard was empty. There was no sign of Paul or the 2 men. I told myself to stay inside, to wait for the police or the power to come back on. But then I thought about Paul, about what they might be doing to him right now. I couldn't just sit there. Gripping the knife tightly, I slipped out the back door, keeping to the shadows as I made my way across the street. The air was heavy, the only sounds the faint rustle of leaves and my own shaky breaths. I reached Paul's house and crouched beside the broken window, listening. Inside, I could hear faint whispers, the words too muffled to make out. Slowly, I peeked through the window. The living room was empty, save for the shattered glass and an overturned chair. The whispers were coming from the hallway, growing louder as I crept closer. I stepped through the broken window, my shoes crunching softly on the glass. The house felt wrong, like the air itself was heavier, suffocating. I reached the hallway and stopped, my heart pounding as I listened to the voices. They were coming from the basement. I hesitated, gripping the knife tighter. "Paul?" I called softly, my voice barely above a whisper. The whispers stopped instantly, replaced by a chilling silence. Then I heard a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on a table. It was coming from the basement stairs. Every instinct told me to turn around and run, but I couldn't leave Paul behind. I moved toward the basement door, the knife trembling in my hand. When I reached it, I pushed it open slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the stillness. The basement was dark, the only light coming from a small, flickering bulb at the bottom of the stairs. I took a deep breath and started down, each step creaking under my weight. Halfway down, the bulb flickered and went out, plunging the basement into darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Paul?" I whispered again, my voice shaking. This time there was an answer, but it wasn't Paul's voice. It was a high, sing-song voice that sent chills down my spine. "He's busy right now," the voice said. The bulb flickered back on, and I saw them standing at the bottom of the stairs. The taller man was holding the bat, his fingers drumming on its handle. The shorter man was crouched beside something on the floor, his hands slick with something dark and wet. They both looked up at me, their faces splitting into wide, toothy grins. "Want to join us?" the taller man asked, tilting his head. Before I could move, the shorter man stood, holding up his hands. In one of them was Paul's bloodied wallet. The shorter man's laughter echoed in the basement, sharp and erratic, as he held up Paul's bloodied wallet like a trophy. I froze halfway down the stairs, gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles ached. "Paul?" I managed to whisper, my voice trembling. The taller man tilted his head, his unsettling smile widening. "He can't hear you," he said softly, his voice eerily calm. The shorter man giggled again, crouching beside the unmoving shape on the floor. I forced myself not to look too closely, but the dark, wet stains pooling underneath left no doubt. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice cracking. The taller man's smile faltered for just a moment, replaced by a look of quiet contemplation. "Why not?" he said simply, as if it were the most obvious answer in the world. I took a shaky step back, my eyes darting toward the door. "I'll leave," I said quickly. "I won't tell anyone. Just let me go." The shorter man looked up, his grin spreading from ear to ear. "That's not how the game works," he said, his voice sing-song and mocking. "What game?" I asked, my heart pounding. The taller man took a step forward, resting the bloodied bat on his shoulder. "The game where we see how far you can run," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. I didn't wait for him to explain. I turned and bolted up the stairs, my shoes slipping on the slick, blood-stained steps. Behind me, I heard their laughter, high-pitched and giddy, like this was all some sort of twisted joke. I slammed the basement door shut and fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn it. The pounding started immediately, loud and frantic, shaking the flimsy door on its hinges. "Run, Jason," the shorter man called through the door, his voice muffled but taunting. "We're coming for you." My breath caught in my throat as I turned and stumbled through the darkened house. I had to get out. The broken front window was my only option. I climbed through it as quickly as I could, the jagged glass tearing at my shirt and scratching my arms. The cool night air hit me like a slap to the face, but I didn't stop to catch my breath. I ran. The streets were eerily quiet, the power outage leaving the neighborhood shrouded in darkness. Every shadow felt alive, every sound a threat. But I didn't dare slow down. I reached my house and burst through the front door, slamming it shut behind me. For a moment, I felt a flicker of relief, but then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the side of the house. I peered through the window, my chest tightening as I saw two figures walking up my driveway, their faces hidden in shadow. "No," I whispered, backing away from the window. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a soft knock on the front door. "Jason," the taller man called, his voice low and sing-song. Come out, wherever you are." The shorter man giggled, the sound grating and unnatural. "We just want to play," he added. I clutched the knife tighter, my mind racing. They knew where I lived. There was no way I could stay here. I crept toward the back door, trying to stay as quiet as possible. But as I reached for the doorknob, I heard the sound of glass shattering from the living room. They were inside. My heart felt like it might explode as I slipped out the back door and into the yard. I crouched low, keeping to the shadows, and made my way toward the woods at the edge of the neighborhood. If I could just make it to the trees, I might have a chance. The laughter followed me, growing louder and more frenzied as I ran. They were toying with me, letting me think I had a head start before closing the distance. Branches tore at my clothes and skin as I plunged deeper into the woods, the darkness swallowing me whole. I could barely see, but I didn't stop. Their voices echoed around me, bouncing off the trees like they were everywhere at once. "Don't run too far, Jason. You'll get lost." I tripped over a root, crashing to the ground hard enough to knock the wind out of me. For a moment, I just lay there, gasping for breath, my ears straining for any sound of pursuit. The forest was silent, too silent. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the knife like a lifeline, and scanned the trees. Nothing. No laughter, no footsteps, just the suffocating quiet. "Where are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. A twig snapped behind me, and I spun around, my heart racing. The taller man stepped out from behind a tree, his smile as wide and unsettling as ever. "Found you," he said softly. I barely had time to react before the shorter man appeared on my left. His face twisted into an expression of pure glee. "Your turn," he said, raising the bat. Before I could move, the taller man lunged at me, knocking the knife from my hand and sending me crashing to the ground. The taller man lunged at me, his hands grasping for my throat. I twisted to the side just in time, his momentum sending him crashing to the ground beside me. The shorter man laughed, raising the bat high above his head. "You're not getting away this time," he shrieked. I rolled to the side as the bat came down, the sound of it splintering against a tree trunk ringing in my ears. Before he could swing again, the faint wail of sirens cut through the night. The laughter stopped instantly. The shorter man's grin faltered as he turned toward the sound, his wide eyes narrowing. "They're coming," the taller man said, his voice low and venomous. "We need to go." The shorter man hesitated, his fingers tightening around the bat. "But we're not done yet," he whined, glancing back at me. "Now," the taller man snapped, grabbing his arm and pulling him into the shadows. I lay there, gasping for breath, my body trembling. The knife was just out of reach, glinting faintly in the moonlight, but I didn't dare move until I was sure they were gone. The sirens grew louder, and moments later, red and blue lights flickered through the trees. "Help!" I shouted, my voice raw and desperate. A beam of light cut through the darkness, and I saw the outline of a police officer stepping cautiously into the woods. "Over here," I called, struggling to sit up. The officer's flashlight landed on me, and I saw his hand move to the radio on his shoulder. "We've got someone here," he said, his voice calm but urgent. Within minutes, more officers arrived, their flashlights crisscrossing the forest as they fanned out. Two of them helped me to my feet, their expressions a mix of concern and disbelief. "What happened?" one of them asked, his eyes scanning the blood on my clothes. "It's them," I said, my voice shaking. "The men from Briar Ridge. They're here." The officers exchanged a glance, their jaws tightening. "We know," the first one said. "They've been terrorizing the neighborhood all night. They killed Paul," I added, my voice breaking. "They're still out here." The second officer nodded grimly. "We'll find them," he said. They led me back to the street, where several police cars were parked with their lights flashing. Neighbors had gathered on their porches, their faces pale and frightened as they watched the scene unfold. An ambulance was parked in front of Paul's house, its back doors open. I looked away, unable to face the reality of what had happened to him. As the paramedics checked me over, I heard snippets of conversations between the officers. They were last seen heading west, toward the old quarry. "Set up a perimeter. Don't let them get any farther." I tried to focus on their words, but my mind was racing, replaying the events of the night over and over. Eventually, a detective approached me, his expression serious but kind. "You're lucky to be alive," he said, crouching down to meet my eyes. "We'll catch them, I promise. But I need you to tell me everything you can remember." I recounted the night as best I could, my voice trembling as I described the basement, the laughter, and the attack in the woods. The detective listened carefully, nodding occasionally and jotting down notes. When I finished, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "You did the right thing coming to us," he said. His words didn't feel comforting. As the hours dragged on, I sat in the back of a police car, watching the chaos unfold around me. Officers combed the woods with dogs and flashlights, their voices echoing through the trees. Every now and then, I heard a distant shout or the crackle of a radio, but there was no sign of the two men. By dawn, the search team returned empty-handed. "They're gone," one of the officers muttered, shaking his head. The detective approached me again, his expression grim. "We'll keep looking," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't optimistic. "They can't have gotten far." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. As the ambulance took me to the hospital, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The memory of their laughter, their faces, their twisted joy, it was burned into my mind. I knew they'd be back. A week later, I moved out of town, unable to bear the memories of that night.